The Pokemon franchise, expanding over 30 years with no end in sight. And of course, why would they end it? It brought a lot of people over the years joy and happiness, carried childhoods, and allowed friendship between people to be formed. Why would such a beloved entity ever take all these things away from people? Who am I kidding? They just keep making cards, game, and merchandise because they bring the franchise
big money.
Money talk. Here comes the money.
They not worried about anybody's feeling. But what if the Pokemon Company were more focused on making a compelling and complete story than they are of bringing profit and revenue? So let's look at the top 3 times when Pokemon should have ended. Just know this is purely opinion based, so if you feel different about when the best opportunity for Pokemon to end was, discuss it in the comments with why you feel that a certain generation would have made the greatest conclusion. Anyways, the criteria that I will be considering for my ranking will be based on 3 things: the lore, the anime, and the gap. The lore will look at, well, the lore. Questions and answers Pokemon fans may have had about individual events and characters involving the games or the Pokemon world. The anime. This is mainly about Ash's performances and victories during a given generation. Just know I've only ever watched up to Generation 4 of the anime, although I do be knowing stuff that happened afterwards. But spoiler, Galar and Paldea won't be seen in this top 3 video since the Paldea anime is ongoing and Galar never really had a proper one. Journey doesn't count, I fear, as they didn't focus on the Galar region. And the final factor is the gap, which is going to be looking at how big the changes are in between generation and why the series should have ended before the gap was created. So for example, I'll use Galar to Paldea, since I already mentioned that Galar won't be in the video. But if it was, this part would look at Pokemon aspect that Galar and maybe previous generations had as well lost during the singular gap. And for this particular gap, that would mean losing the ability to fight gym leaders in a set order. I know this particular example may not seem that important, but trust me, the gaps will make much more sense in the actual top 3. Anyway, that's enough yapping about the criteria, let's just start. In 3rd place, I have the Kalos region, the region that introduced the least amount of new Pokemon at 72. This low amount of Pokemon had people speculating if they ran out of ideas for new ones. It was also the last generation to introduce both a new type and an evolution. But alongside these 72 new Pokemon, we also got 46 Mega Evolutions. Now looking at the lore and the generation as well, we obviously are informed about Mega Evolution, although there are still some unanswered questions about all of it, which might get answered in Legends EA. But since it's not out yet, I can't speak on it. Some say Megas were formed from the ultimate weapon in Kalos over 3,000 years ago. Some say it came from Rayquaza and meteorites. Nonetheless, it's a mechanic that allows some Pokemon to surpass their limit and perform at their absolute peak. Basically, their ultimate forms. As for the anime, we get introduced to the character known as Serena, the main female protagonist for the X and Y series, who is supposedly one of Ash's childhood friend. Realistically, I wouldn't know because I never watched it, I'm just getting my information off Pokemon Wiki.
Are you serious right now, bro?
So ending Ash's story in the same series he reunites with his long lost friend would have been very fitting. Also, Ash's performance in this league was one of his best, going all the way to the final where he lost in a final battle between his Ash bonded Greninja and Alan's Mega Charizard X. In my opinion, X and Y had the best animation out of the entire anime series. So if he had just won and retired in a generation where he, for the first time, had a roster of fully evolved Pokemons while battling in the Pokemon League, excluding for Pikachu of course, I wouldn't have any problems with it. All things considered, the generation of Kalos could have had the singular best conclusion for Pokemon, anime wise. But let's finally look at gaps between Kalos and the preceding generation of Alola. We start getting introduced to the concept of regional forms, which in my opinion is just a cop-out of just using the same Pokemon again with a redesign and a type change. These Pokemon could have easily been their own Pokemons with own unique name. Furthermore, the next generation of Alola removed the concept of gym leaders, which removes the requirement of needing 8 badges to qualify in the Pokemon League, which is just
dumb.
Finally, this dude Ash looks like an absolute in the next generation of Alola. They really could have ended it with a high animation and him looking mature, instead of looking like this. I really don't like the Alola anime design or Alola in general. I'm top 1 Alola hater of all time. Anyways, on to number 2. In 2nd place, I have the Johto region. Looking at the lore, we know that Johto was directly connected with Kanto, allowing access for players to travel both regions, allowing trainers to fight a total of 16 gym leaders. The main antagonist group in Johto is also Team Rocket, who are still trying to get their boss Giovanni back from retirement, who we found out has a son known as Silver, which is the main rival for Generation 2. This generation is also the final generation where Team Rocket plays a pivotal part in being antagonist. as you the player will defeat what remains of them and force them to disband, thus removing all evil in the Pokemon world at that time. Johto also shares the same Champions League with Kanto, known as the Indigo Plateau, where you can see some familiar faces. Koga has been promoted from Gym Leader to Elite Four, Bruno is still an Elite Four member, and Lance went from Elite Four to Champion. And finally, Generation 2 possibly had the coolest final boss in the franchise, with Red, where the main protagonist of the previous game faced off against the main protagonist of the new game. Seeing two protagonists meet up is always elite in any form of medias. I don't care what you say. In the anime side of things, we get closure on finally getting to know what that giant golden bird was in the first episode, which we all know now is Ho-Oh, the box legendary for Pokemon Gold and Heart Gold. Another thing that we see come to an end during the Johto anime series was the rivalry between Ash and Gary. They were set up as rival from the very start, with Gary being perceived as better after their initial counter. But they never really had a real match until this moment because the gap between them was too large. Gary was busy winning 10 gym badges in a region that only had 8.
Bruh.
When they finally clash in the Johto League, we see an epic showdown between Blastoise and Charizard, where Charizard comes out as victorious, and Ash finally defeating his lifelong rival. However, he was eliminated in the tournament as a top 8, as he was defeated by some bootleg Joey Wheeler who came off a tennis tournament from Wimbledon. Of course, if you won this league, I would have no choice but to have placed Johto as number 1 on being the best possible conclusion for Pokemon. Let's finally look at the gaps that Johto create between itself and Hoenn. First, which is widely known, the next generation of Hoenn isn't directly connected with the Johto region. So for the first time in Pokemon history, you abstain far and away from the core of Pallet Town, making it seem like the next generation doesn't want to have any affiliation with the previous ones. Also, we see Misty, the first female protagonist, leave Ash to become the Cerulean gym leader. I think it would have been much better if the original trio of Ash, Misty, and Brock all ended their journey together, and have someone else become a new protagonist instead. And one last part I want to look at for Johto though is glitches. Now we all know that Kanto has 151 Pokemons. The thing is that there was originally planned to be 190 Pokemon in the original games. However, due to the overall amount of data cartridges could hold back in the day, and maybe even some future planning, 39 of those Pokemons were scrapped in the final version of Red and Green. These 39 Pokemons will come out as glitched missing no when doing a trade involving some Pokemons from Gold, Silver, and Crystal to Blue, Red, and Yellow. Those 39 Pokemons being Scizor, Shuckle, Heracross, Sneasel, Teddy Ursa, Ursaring, Slugma, Magcargo, Swinub, Piloswine, Corsola, Remoraid, Octillery, Delibird, Mantine, Skarmory, Houndour, Houndoom, Kingdra, Phanpy, Donphan, Porygon2, Stantler, Smeargle, Tyrogue, Hitmontop, Smoochum, Elekid, Magby, Miltank, Blissey, Raikou, Entei, Suicune, Larvitar, Pupitar, Tyranitar, Lugia, and Ho-Oh. I'm not retaking that. All of which are of course seen in Generation 2, meaning that in Johto we see all the Pokemon that were initially intended and could have very well been the end of the series until they realized the amount of popularity and money the franchise has brought to them, so they continued to create more, thus leading me to place Johto as being the second best possible ending for Pokemon. In first place, and the generation that I believe would have made the best possible conclusion for the franchise of Pokemon, is Sinnoh. In the lore, we get introduced to Arceus, the first Pokemon to ever exist that is able to create life, such as the Creation Trio and the Lake Trio, which then leads to every other Pokemon being formed into existence in one way or another. Basically, in the lore, if there is no Arceus, there is no Pokeverse. It is able to change into all Pokemon types and have the highest base stat value of regular formed Pokemons. If anyone ever had questions on where Pokemons came from or whatnot, those got solved in the Sinnoh region by just propping it up to Arceus as starting it all. The Sinnoh region also had a large influx of Pokemon evolution and pre-evolution, almost as if they were trying to have every Pokemon complete an entire evolution line before they possibly ended. And alongside the strongest Pokemon, Sinnoh also had the strongest champion in Cynthia, whose Garchomp striked fear into every trainer, while also having a proper team composition. A region that is paired up with the strongest Pokemons and the strongest champion could have made one hell of an ending. As for the anime, we are introduced to Ash's greatest rival ever, in Paul, a trainer who valued the strength of a Pokemon rather than bonds and connection. The valuation of strength led to Paul beating Ash multiple times, with him even releasing Chimchar along the way, as he deemed it weak and unworthy of being on his team. This then eventually led to one of the greatest showdowns in Pokemon history, with Paul's Electivire, who was his first Pokemon who was always deemed as strong, and Ash's Infernape, who's trying to finally get revenge against Paul for considering him to be weak. This would have been one of the greatest conclusions in the Pokemon League if it only had happened in the final. Unfortunately, it wasn't in the final battle of the tournament. and they decided that after this victory that Ash would be fighting some dude named Tobias in the next round. A character simply created just so they had a reason for Ash not to win. Also, this was a series where Brock finally left Ash to go back to Kanto. If Ash had won the league, he and Brock could have went back and lived the rest of their lives in Kanto together. But now let's look at the gaps. The greatest evidence that Sinnoh would have been the perfect ending for Pokemon. At first, I will look at the geography of Sinnoh. For those who don't know, the first 4 generations of Pokemon were based off regions of Japan. You can see by this graphic exactly what those areas are. Kanto and Johto are directly connected as they are in the game. Hoenn and Sinnoh aren't connected but still nearby the main central area of Kanto and Johto. This also ties back to why Sinnoh has a lot of pre-evolution and evolution of Pokemon from previous generations, as now it's clear that all of these Pokemon reside in the same country. Another thing between the gap of Sinnoh and Unova that didn't happen in previous generation was that Sinnoh was the first generation that didn't show a Pokemon from the following generation in the anime, making it unsure if there were going to be any more Pokemon after Sinnoh. For example, Kanto showed Ho-Oh and Togepi prior to Generation 2, Johto showed Blaziken and Kecleon before Generation 3, and Hoenn showed Munchlax. However, Sinnoh didn't show any Unovan Pokemon in the anime. Yes, Zoroark did make an appearance, but that was in a movie rather than the actual anime. So people who only watched the anime wouldn't have known of such a creature past Sinnoh. And finally, the greatest reason why I feel Sinnoh would have made the greatest conclusion in Pokemon is that the gap between Sinnoh and Unova was the only time a new generation of Pokemon never had any connection to any previous Pokemons. So to make things clear, Johto had a bunch of baby Pokemons for Pokemon seen in Generation 1. Hoenn had Azurill and Wynaut, which are pre-evolutions of Pokemon seen in Generation 2. Sinnoh, as mentioned earlier, had numerous amount of evolution from previous generations. Kalos had Sylveon, which connects with the Gen 1 Eevee, and any region following Kalos had regional forms of Pokemon that were previously seen. Unova was the only one that didn't extend on pre-existing evolutionary lines, giving off a mirage that the Unova region has no connection to the previous worlds. This can be further seen as Pikachu, who just came off battling Latios neck and neck, losing to a level 5 Snivy. They could have just easily decided to have Ash's journey end in Sinnoh instead of ruining the reputation of Pikachu. Anyways, that was my top 3 best time the Pokemon series should have ended. Perhaps I was waffling too much and wasn't making much sense, but it is what it is. Do you guys agree with Kalos, Johto, and Sinnoh being good endings for Pokemon? Or do you believe some other generation would have been better? Comment down below your opinion, and yeah, that's about it.